Well, ladies and gentlemen, once again, welcome to this weekend edition on the 9th day of July 2022. Well, we're streaming live from Brisbane, where the weather is beautiful, 11 degrees with sunny conditions for the weekend. As we know, there's so many functions that have been planned for the weekend. But ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to say that pick up your copy of Brisbane Indian Times. The latest edition is out and about, so go to your favorite outlet and pick up your copies. If you have any problems getting your hands on any copies, please let us know, and we'll make sure and we'll guide you to the nearest outlet which is close to you. Well, right now, the whole world, the entire world is waking up to this devastating news. The news where, the Prime Minister was shot. Right now, let's take a look at that critical moment. So there you are, as you've just witnessed that, that moment when the shot was fired. Well, what is the global, reaction to that?
The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, as we saw just then, has said the tragic death of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is devastating news. On behalf of the government and people, we offer our deepest sympathies. Mr Abe was one of Australia's closest friends on the world stage. It was his vision that helped elevate our bilateral relationship. I had the privilege of travelling to Japan for the Quad meetings. In many ways, this grouping is a legacy of Mr Abe's diplomatic activism. He will be greatly missed. Former Prime Minister Tony Abbott likewise has said that with the death of Shinzo Abe in an act of shocking violence, Australia has lost a great friend and Japan has lost its most significant post-war leader. He goes on to say he was the father of the Quad, a friend to Taiwan and a staunch defender of liberal values. This is a dreadful loss for Japan, for Australia and for a world where democracy stands strong and together.
So they've been all pretty powerful tributes. He has been a solid presence, Shinzo Abe, that is, in Japan for a long time. It just goes to show you that the Japanese system of leadership is very different to what we see in, say, somewhere like Australia, where we almost have a description of a revolving doors of prime ministers, as opposed to what they've got over there, which seems to be very stable government.
Well, Shinzo Abe was the person who, in a way, put an end to the revolving door in Japan. They did have a great period of instability there. He was Prime Minister on 2 occasions. He resigned after the first stint as Prime Minister when he had a lot of political problems and then returned. Probably he would be the best known Japanese Prime Minister for Australians. He became the first Japanese leader to address Australia's Parliament. When he made a reference to the events of the Second World War, he said, "We will never let the horrors of the past repeat themselves." And in 2018, Shinzo Abe landed in Darwin 76 years after the bombs fell, after Darwin was bombed by the Japanese. At the time, he said it's an important time of reconciliation, and for some I know that will always be difficult. So he did attempt to address Japan's past and Japan's behaviour during the Second World War, and he forged a very, very close relationship with Australian political leaders who are tonight in shock at his death.
And also, I guess to your point there, those on the Kokoda track were also mentioned in that speech, so it does sort of go to show that even though Japan, I guess, was marred by its historical atrocities, there was some attempt to repair the relationship with Australia, and I guess that was in the establishment of the Quad too. Tell us about the Quad, its purposes and how that fared internationally.
That's right. Mr Abe is credited with coming up with the idea for the Quad, which of course is a grouping of Japan, the US, India and Australia. And Mr Abe was well known for his support of Taiwan and therefore his implicit criticism of China and Xi Jinping's often repeated comments that he will, quote, reclaim Taiwan. Shinzo Abe was in a way a bulwark against that push by Chinese leadership, especially Xi Jinping. The Quad was formed. Australia is delighted with the Quad because it is seen as a way of trying to reduce or push back Chinese influence in the Pacific. Mr Abe came up with the notion and it went ahead and formed itself. Associated Press is tonight saying that while credited with bringing a degree of stability to Japan following a period of economic malaise, Shinzo Abe angered his neighbours South Korea and China, along with many Japanese, with his nationalistic rhetoric and calls to revise the country's pacifist constitution. As one of our previous guests said earlier, Shinzo Abe was quite a polarising figure within Japan. People had strong views on him. He had many opponents in Japan, but in the end, obviously, he marked a major presence in the country.
So there you are, ladies and gentlemen. The whole world is now waking up to this devastating news. And of course, it has sent shockwaves all around the country. Well, on the other, staying on the sort of international flavour, let's take a look at Jacinda Ardern, New Zealand's Prime Minister, and what she had to say in Australia.
The issues we navigate as a society, after all, will only intensify. The disinformation will only increase. The pull into the comfort of our tribes will be magnified. But we have it within us to ensure that that doesn't mean we fracture. We are richer for our difference and poorer for our division.
That was quite a speech that you gave a couple of months ago to this year's graduates at Harvard University. Do you really think, as you said in that speech, that personal empowerment can save democracy from the threat of social media disinformation?
I mean, that's not for a moment to take away the responsibility that our social media platforms and online operators have. And I spent a bit of time in that speech talking about where I believe we need to go together, government, civil society and those platforms. But I think it is fair to say that we have tools now that do need to demonstrate great responsibility. We know that the content that we consume is curated for us. Let's have more transparency around how that's done, because it is having an impact on our democracies and our day-to-day lives.
So in 2019, a racist right-wing terrorist murdered a large number of people in 2 New Zealand mosques.
Yes.
He was radicalised.
Yeah, he was.
Online. Did that turn you into an advocate for government regulation of social media platforms?
I think it turned New Zealand into advocates for change. And I think what we have to recognise with these tools, and what in many cases actually can be powerful tools for good as well, it turned us into advocates for ensuring that in those spaces where you see rapid technological advancement, actually regulation has a part to play, but it won't always be able to keep up with the change that we see. And so we advocated that we all play our part. And that's what the Christchurch call to action was. It was to bring to the table civil society, government and the tech companies and say, for each of our responsibilities, we need to take action, because we can all agree that no one wants to see online platforms or the internet generally used to radicalise or create violent extremism, and yet that is what we are seeing.
Let's move to the Pacific, because obviously that's going to be a major focus of your meetings with Anthony Albanese and obviously at the Pacific Forum next week. Do you see your government as being in a strategic partnership with Australia to counter China's growing influence in the region?
I think that, Australia and New Zealand have a long-standing friendship.
The world is changing. Forgive me for interrupting, but the world has clearly changed. Is it changing your relationship with Australia?
No, I don't believe so, actually. If anything, I think in many ways it brings us closer together. We have many shared values. You wouldn't find economically a closer relationship than New Zealand and Australia. We often refer to Australia as family, and that brings with it, the ability to speak frankly with one another when we disagree. But within the Pacific, we also, New Zealand sees itself of the Pacific. We see ourselves as this being both how we identify, but also where we have a responsibility. And I see that same approach from Australia too.
How threatening would it be to the security both of New Zealand and of Australia if China establishes a military presence in the Solomon Islands?
Yeah, well, we've been very clear that we're opposed to the militarisation of the region. But look, we can take that position in a country-neutral way. It doesn't matter whom. It's a position we take broadly on, from a New Zealand perspective. But here, actually, we fall back again to the regional architecture we have in the Pacific, and that's the Pacific Island Forum. We've explicitly, within the Bikitawa and Boe declarations, we've all signed up to the idea that should we have security challenges ourselves as Pacific members, that we resolve those and address those together, and that's all that we've called for.
As you just said, you're also very conscious of respecting the sovereignty of those nations.
Absolutely.
So how far can you go without appearing to bully?
No, and this is where we're really clear. Look, China has had relationships in our region for many, many years. And so let's of course not forget that. But we've always also, within the Pacific Island Forum, been very clear. If it comes to security issues, if it comes to issues that could be conceived to be militarisation, there we have agreement that we come together and we discuss that as a forum, because that affects all of us.
With all the domestic, economic and all the pandemic pressures in New Zealand, did you miss what China was up to in the Solomons?
Well, again, here, I think it's important to point out, our Pacific neighbours have long had relationships with China. That is not new. What we have an eye to, though, is whether or not those relationships continue to uphold the values that we have as a region. First, Pacific priorities first, and actually the Pacific priorities are climate change first and foremost. Making sure, again, that when it comes to our security needs, that we work with one another. So, in fact, I think the Pacific has been very consistent, but we do see change around us in approach. But for the most part, the Pacific continues to respond in the same way they always have.
But were you blindsided? Was it an intelligence failure by both New Zealand and Australia?
No, I think it actually, to be fair, I've actually pushed back on that sentiment because, again, I feel that doesn't acknowledge the sovereignty of Pacific Island nations to determine their own relationships. It is not for New Zealand or Australia to dictate the relationships that Pacific Island neighbours have with others.
Just to go back to that question, what kind of a threat would it pose if China were to establish a military presence, however?
Look, for us, the position is very clear. We believe that escalation in our region and militarisation in our region is not necessary, not called for and not wanted. So we're very clear on that.
In response to China's military expansion, Australia is planning to build a fleet of nuclear submarines with the assistance of the US and the UK. At the same time, does New Zealand plan to expand its naval and air forces to join in this tougher response?
Well, again, it would be for Australia to, I think, identify the imperative behind the decisions that they make in terms of their own capability and fleet. That's ultimately for them. Look, for us, you can see in our defence strategy that we're very much Pacific focused, and that's because of who we are and where we are. And so a lot of what we're responding to in our region is actually one of the greatest security threats that we face, which is climate change.
You say before country neutral, but you were recently on the stage at NATO, and NATO obviously issued a new strategy that recognised a threat from China for the first time. Have you moved now beyond that point of neutrality? It's certainly how the Chinese see it.
I think it's important not to confuse the term country neutral with neutrality or not entering into the fray on foreign policy issues as they emerge. Simply, when we talk in that way, the point we're making is we have a very strong set of values, and that actually it's not about targeting any one individual country. If we see others who don't share those values and breach, for for instance, the international rules-based order, we will speak up about that. And so, for instance, if an example is, the obviously illegal war in Ukraine, we will speak up about that. We will put in place, as we have, sanctions. We will respond in a very direct way. And you'll see other examples that we, for instance, issues we've raised to the Human Rights Council around the plight of the Uyghur people. It's very much, if it's in breach of our values, regardless of who it is, we will speak up on that.
At the same time, China is your biggest trading partner, and at a time when the New Zealand economy is really struggling. How do you confront China? Well, I think everyone's economy is struggling.
Sure.
I'm not singling you out. Obviously, an aggressive raise in interest rates, we're all battling with the same forces.
Sure. I would just point out our relatively low levels of debt, historically low unemployment, and good solid GDP growth. But apart from that, we are experiencing CPI increases.
Thank you very much. Tourism New Zealand. There is a global economic challenge,
absolutely.
A significant one. So how do you confront your biggest trading partner without threatening your economic interests?
I think here, we've been clearly of the view that trade and having strong trading relationships is actually, in our view, in our region's interest. But that should never stop any nation from being able to equally voice concerns about issues that they see in their region or that affect them as a nation.
And of course, quite rightfully said, there are issues that are in the region, and of course that's quite the conversation there. And I think when you look at the Pacific Way as well, we'll see what comes out of that Pacific Islands Forum as well, and we'll keep you updated. Well, right now we go to Sydney, where tens of thousands of Sydneysiders are affected by this flooding.
It's been another heartbreaking day for tens of thousands of people caught up in Sydney's flood emergency. More homes and businesses are underwater. There are more than 70 evacuation orders in place. And there's a dangerous rescue operation underway in wild seas near Sydney. We have reporters in key locations tonight. Mark Reddy begins our coverage.
A stalled cargo ship, no match for this wild weather. Winds pushing it dangerously close to the cliffs at the Royal National Park, with 21 crew helpless on board.
They were departed Port Kembla yesterday. They were off on a voyage. They have a main engine failure and suddenly they're drifting towards the rocks.
A rescue helicopter was dispatched, but after multiple attempts to reach the crew, the mission was aborted. 2 anchors slowed the drag towards the coast. Tugboat drivers risked their lives to help steer the ship away from shore.
We've got 8-metre swells out there, 30 knots. It's atrocious conditions out there.
The aim is to get the Hong Kong-based ship well off the coast tonight before the weather deteriorates further.
They're confident that they can actually make an engine repair once they get out into safe deep water.
Inland flooding fears were reached as torrential rains caused further spillage from the Warragamba Dam.
That water did move downstream and affect North Richmond last night. They received levels similar to what they saw in March 21.
We found Gary Evans using his boat to try to retrieve what he could from his partially submerged home upstream. What's the damage like? Have you seen it?
Oh, it's devastating. But this is the 3rd time, yeah.
His son brought his dinghy to help save what they could as floodwaters rose. Neighbours' homes are abandoned.
Some of those images are truly heartbreaking, seeing people's homes, their lives turned upside down again.
Quick thinking saved these cattle in Richmond before flash flooding submerged paddocks last night.
Our backyard is now part of the Hawkesbury River.
Despite conditions easing, authorities warned flooding in Windsor is still on the rise.
A lot of us aren't coping. There's a lot of people in the area that are elderly. Basically, we're stuck, we're stranded.
To see what we're seeing right across Sydney, there's no doubt these events are becoming more common, and governments need to adjust and make sure that we respond to the changing environment that we find ourselves in.
Thousands of people are now...
The key point there is, as I mentioned even yesterday and day before yesterday, is that we cannot control the rain, but what Mr. Parrott had said there was that we need to be able to identify the risks and have our warning systems in place so that people are in the areas that would be affected are warned early in the stage and evacuated from the areas. and then afterwards, the relief measures must be made available ASAP, and that could be, resources, meaning food supplies, building supplies, and of course monitoring as well when we're looking at insurances and other things. So, rules and regulations should be in place that if it is a flood, it's a flood. It's nothing that the insured would have done. It is an act of nature, and it should be covered. That's what insurances are for, or that's what people pay the premium for. So these are the key things that really need to be put in place as far as nature goes, rain goes. You can't control that. It will rain, so we need to live with that. But we should have better warning mechanisms, and then people should be warned well ahead of time, evacuated, and then the emergency crew on standby should something go wrong, and people with the warnings make sure that no one drives into these flooded areas. And we've seen a lot of things many times happen because people take that risk of driving through flood waters, not realizing that there could be dangerous currents, and misjudging the strength of those currents as well. So there you are, ladies and gentlemen, up to date on the weekend edition of Australian Indian Radio's show. Right now, let's go to Springfield and Ipswich, where the decision on that bridge that was named after the previous Mayor Paul Pasali. And of course, we knew that, what he did for the community at that time, but of course, once you're disgraced, you are disgraced. So let's take a look at that report and see what has the community or the councillors now decided.
5 years after he sensationally resigned as Ipswich Mayor, 2 years after he was found guilty of sexual assault and fraud, Paul Pasali's name is set to be officially scratched from council assets.
Those in favour, please raise your hand.
Last Thursday, the council voted to keep the former mayor and convicted sex offender's name on this bridge and a road at Yamanto. A week later, 2 councillors have had a change of heart.
When you make a mistake, you own it. That's a mistake for me.
Let me get this straight. I do not stand for our prior mayor's predatory actions and having his name anywhere in our city.
They say they will now vote to have his name removed, putting their indecision down to inexperience.
We had questions left unanswered, and in a moment of confusion, we voted to reinstate it. Councillor Jonica and myself have only been councillors for 2 years. We're not established veterans of local government.
They say they initially questioned whether the community supported Pasali's name being removed.
There has been some influence, political influence from the mayor.
An accusation strongly denied by Mayor Teresa Harding. Paul Pasali is serving a 7.5-year jail term for fraud, corruption, perjury and sexual assault. He's eligible for parole in October. The council is expected to formally vote to remove his name from its roadways next week. Toby Jers-Lewis, ABC News.
So, getting rid of all the signs and everything there, the councillors now have a change of heart. Well, ladies and gentlemen, today at 10 a.m. we have a very special interview coming up with Madhu Khanna as your host and Pinky Singh OIM as the guest speaker, and just a disclaimer that interview will be in Hindi, but it's a very special interview today at 10 a.m. our time that's coming up. And of course, also what's happening today is the Palki Festival. So here's a few people from the Science and Star organization inviting you to that function.
ਸਤਿ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ ਮੈਂ ਰਣਜੀਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਸਾਇੰਸ ਸਮਾਜ ਬ੍ਰਿਸਬਨ ਨਾਰਥ ਸਾਈਡ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਆਪ ਸਭ ਨੂੰ ਗੁਰੂ ਪੂਰਨਿਮਾ ਦੇ ਪਾਵਨ ਮੌਕੇ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਸ਼ਾਮਲ ਹੋਣ ਦਾ ਇਨਵੀਟੇਸ਼ਨ ਦਿੰਦਾ ਹਾਂ। ਇਹ ਇਵੈਂਟ 9 ਜੁਲਾਈ ਨੂੰ ਵਰਜੀਨੀਆ ਸਟੇਟ ਸਕੂਲ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮਨਾਇਆ ਜਾਏਗਾ। ਇਹ ਇੱਕ ਮਲਟੀਕਲਚਰਲ ਔਰ ਇੰਟਰਫੇਥ ਇਵੈਂਟ ਹੋਣ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਇੱਕ ਪਰਿਵਾਰਿਕ ਇਵੈਂਟ ਵੀ ਹੈ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੀਆਂ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਫ੍ਰੀ ਐਕਟੀਵਿਟੀਜ਼ ਹੋਣਗੀਆਂ ਔਰ ਨਾਲ ਹੀ ਡਿਲੀਸ਼ੀਅਸ ਫੂਡ ਔਰ ਚਾਹ ਦੇ ਵੀ ਸਟਾਲ ਲੱਗਣਗੇ। ਸਾਰੇ ਮਿਲਦੇ ਆ ਉਸ ਗੁਰਪੂਰਨਿਮਾ ਦੇ ਇਵੈਂਟ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ।
வணக்கம்
பிரிஸ்பன் நார்த் சைட் சாய் கம்யூனிட்டி சார்பாக உங்கள் அனைவரையும் குரு பூர்ணிமா விழாவுக்கு அன்புடன் வரவேற்பதில் மகிழ்ச்சி கொள்கிறேன். இந்த விழா ஜூலை மாதம் 9ஆம் தேதி சனிக்கிழமை அன்று வர்ஜீனியா ஸ்டேட் ஸ்கூல் ஹால் 3 மணி முதல் நடைபெற உள்ளது. இந்த விழாவில் குழந்தைகளுக்கு பிடித்த ரெப்டைல் ஷோ, மேஜிக் ஷோ, பெட்டிங் ஜூ, ஃபேஸ் பெயிண்டிங், பலூன் ட்விஸ்டிங், ஜம்பிங் காசில், கேண்டி ஃப்ளாஸ் எல்லாம் இருக்கிறது. இது ஒரு இலவச விழா. கண்டிப்பாக எல்லாரும் உங்கள் குடும்பத்துடன் நண்பர்களுடன் வர வேண்டும். வரவேற்கிறோம். थैंक यू.
मेरा नाम विमल आनंद है और मैं साई कम्युनिटी नॉर्थ साइड का सदस्य हूं. मैं आप सबको गुरु पूर्णिमा महोत्सव के लिए सादर आमंत्रित करना चाहता हूं. ये बहुत सांस्कृतिक और पारिवारिक उत्सव है जो 9 जुलाई वर्जीनिया स्टेट स्कूल में 3 बजे से शुरू होगा. मैं बहुत उत्साहित हूं इस दिन के लिए क्योंकि हमने सूफी संगीत का आयोजन भी किया है. अपनी फ्री टिकट trybooking.com से डाउनलोड करें और #साई बाबा पालकी ब्रिस्बेन 2022 पे अपने आप को टैग करें इंस्टाग्राम पे. धन्यवाद.
નમસ્તે ભાઈઓ, બહેનો, વડીલો અને બાળકો. હું જીતેન્દ્ર અગ્રાવત આપ સૌને બ્રિસ્બેન સાઈ સમાજ નોર્થ સાઇડ તરફથી આયોજન કરવામાં આવેલ મલ્ટીકલ્ચરલ ઇન્ટરફેથ ફેમિલી ફ્રેન્ડલી ગુરુ પૂર્ણિમા કાર્યક્રમ માટે આમંત્રણ આપવા માગું છું. ગુરુ પૂર્ણિમાનો કાર્યક્રમ 9 જુલાઈ શનિવાર બપોરના 3થી રાતના 9 વાગ્યા સુધીનો રહેશે, જેમાં 3થી 5ની વચ્ચે ઘણા બિઝનેસ સ્ટોલ રાખવામાં આવેલ છે, જેમાં ઇથનિક, ક્લોથ, જ્વેલરી, રાખડી જેવી આઇટમ્સ જોવા મળશે. તેમાં બાળકો માટે યુસીમાસ મેસ દ્વારા મેન્ટલ મેસ વિશે માહિતી આપવામાં આવશે. સાંજના 6થી 9ની વચ્ચે સાંઈબાબાની પાલખી અને ત્યારબાદ ડાન્સ અને ગરબાનું આયોજન કરવામાં આવેલ છે. તો આપ સૌને જરૂરથી પધારવા ખૂબ ખૂબ ભાવભર્યું આમંત્રણ છે. પ્લીઝ ડાઉનલોડ યોર ફ્રી ટિકિટ્સ ફ્રોમ www.trybooking.com/BYZKT. પ્લીઝ ટેગ યોર સેલ્ફ સાંઈ બાબા પાલકી બ્રિસ્બેન 2022. થેન્ક યુ. પ્લીઝ કમ.
खम्मा घणी. मारो नाम यूरी शेखावत है और आपा शेखावाटी राजस्थान हुआ. आपने शहर ब्रिस्बेन के मायने नॉर्थ साइड में निवासी हाँ और आप सब ने आमंत्रित करा. आप पधारो. साईं बाबा पालकी फेस्टिवल शनिवार 9 जुलाई. आप पधारो वर्जीनिया स्टेट स्कूल हॉल. फुल फैमिली फ्रेंडली इवेंट. DJ Yuri will be there playing devotional music followed by full family friendly Bollywood party to finish the night off. तो आप पधारो. शनिवार 9 जुलाई. #साईं बाबा पालकी ब्रिस्बेन 2022. जय माता जी की.
Hi everyone, this is Abby from the Sai Baba Group on Brisbane's North Side, inviting you to our multicultural, interfaith, family-friendly celebrations of Guru Purnima on July 9th, 2022 at Virginia State School. It's a Saturday, so it's going to be lots of fun and the whole family can come. There's going to be fun fair activities for the kids, including jumping castle, face painting, even some baby animals and reptiles to come and pat. There'll be fabulous cultural experiences through dance, music, there'll be Sufi singing and some amazing dancing that you don't want to miss. Please come and join us and download your tickets at TryBookings and #us at Sai Baba Palaki Brisbane 2022 to join the fun online. See you soon.
There you go, ladies and gentlemen, the Palki Festival happening today, as we heard there, in all different languages. So it is wonderful. And don't forget that we have a very special interview coming up at 10 today, conducted by Madhu Khanna, and the guest speaker would be none other than Pinky Singh, the newly appointed OIM, and that's coming up today at 10. And as I've mentioned before, that will be conducted in Hindi. We'd like to welcome you all to come and join on that. So, well, right now it's time to take a look at functions and events happening right here in Brisbane. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's about all we have time for you in this segment. Don't forget that next up we will be having our special interview with Madhu Khanna, where she interviews Pinky Singh right here on this channel. Until then, it's goodbye from us. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.